moving to the final address of our second plenary session. For that, I would like to invite our session chair, Professor Vidyanand Jha sir, an eminent academician and distinguished professor in the organizational behavior area at the Institute of Management, Calcutta. Professor Jha sir joined IIM Calcutta in 1997 after completing his PhD from IIM Ahmedabad and has since devoted nearly 3 decades to shaping the fields of management education, leadership, and organizational studies in India. His area of expertise include organizational theory, change leadership, knowledge management, creativity and innovation, and the management of organizational change. A visionary educator, Professor Jha sir designed and introduced the unique and widely appreciated course titled Philosophical and Historical Foundations of Business, reflecting his deep interdisciplinary understanding of management and human thought. He has also led several acclaimed management development programs, including Being More Creative and Communication and Presentation Skills. Over the years, he has trained and mentored senior professionals from leading organizations such as Hindustan Unilever, L&T, Exide, and Indian Oil, making remarkable contributions to corporate leadership and executive education. Beyond the world of management, Professor Jha sir is also widely celebrated as an accomplished poet, fiction writer, and translator in the Maithili language. His literary works have been translated into several Indian languages like Hindi, English, Bangla, and Telugu. In recognition of his literary excellence, he was honored with a prestigious Katha Award for Translation in 1999. We are truly privileged to have Professor Vidyanand Jha sir with us today as the chair of this plenary session. Today, he is going to address us on the topic Meditation on Being a Maithili Poet. I humbly call upon Professor Vidyanand Jha sir to deliver this address.
Thank you to Dr. Kumari, and let me just first be done with my session chair observations. So my session chair observations, in fact, I would forewarn there are 2 Mishras, by both sides. So I'll forewarn both the Mishras that will land up at their place actually. Of course, Mr. Pankaj Mishra, I have last year I became 60. So after this, even earlier, I think Professor, Dr. Fanikant Mishra was saying that cranial capacity of Maithils is high, but I would like to think that Maithils are by nature more curious actually. So than this, I teach creativity, so I realize that my creativity right now is going into multiple directions. In fact, this year I enrolled in Nalanda University, the new university established at Nalanda, in a course of Buddhist philosophy. And whatever Pankaj was saying in one sentence which he said, I think I need to sit with him for hours to understand what he was saying actually, because he just traced the history of Indian philosophy in one long sentence. And obviously he kind of, marked the role of Mithila in that. Dr. Mishra's actually, we were very fortunate to have the first-hand actually report on archaeological sites in Mithila, and I do hope that the current kind of political will help excavate more in Mithila. Of course, I disagree with his larger kind of idea about 2 + 2 is always 4 in archaeology, because I don't believe too much of whatever is happening to Rakhegadi as a site. So what happened to me that during whole of pandemic, I actually got obsessed with Harappa, and I actually attended lots of talks from Harappan scholars and so on. I can't claim actually that I have experts' knowledge of archaeology, but I do have some outsiders kind of knowledge of archaeology as a field. So even on that count, Mithila is right now well placed because Mithila is being established as a land of Janaki. That is in the larger political kind of agenda, and I do hope that even that at least will kind of help encourage finding which was the potential capital of Mithila. I would like to express my gratitude to Vijayji, who organized this whole thing. And I was just telling him yesterday when he called me up that I, for one, would be very interested in reading the conference proceedings, because the sessions which he has been able to organize, and I'm really, uh, sad that I could not attend many of sessions. In fact, these days I have teaching on weekends. We teach executives through distance kind of learning thing. So today also I'll have teaching. Yesterday I had teaching and so on. But if I did not have teaching, I would have loved to sit through all the sessions, and they look very nice. Let me also say another hi actually to a fellow translator. So I can see uh, somebody, Dr. Yug Lit, that is what I know him as, and he translated, Maithili novel, very famous Maithili novel called, Prithviputr into English. So from my introduction, you would have realized that one of the things which, apart from my own poetry, and I sometimes think at the cost of my own poetry, which I do is translation of Maithili things into English. Now, again, translation comes very natural to my things. And I'll maybe talk about that in a moment. In fact, I have a series of poems planned on translation because I was not educated in my mother tongue. I don't speak my mother tongue anywhere actually. So that is where my whole life, and in fact, not only my life of all Mathils is an act of constant translation. We are always translating whatever is happening to us in terms of our body, in terms of our tastes, in terms of everything. That's a constant act of translation. But having said that, not too much of Mathili literature is actually translated into English. And as of today, English has become a kind of global highway. If you want to be known as a literature, you need to get translated into English. And of course, earlier translations within, rather amongst Indian languages, used to happen one to one. So, for example, and that's good actually at some level, because I remember I have the biggest translation job which I did from any other language into Maithili was Vachana poetry from Karnataka. And Vachana poetry is basically there are these people who propagate Vachana poetry. So Vachanas were basically Shaivite hymns, which were written by a large number of people from non-Brahman castes actually. And the idea was that they said that if we are stopped from entering the temples, let our bodies become temples, and that is how they were called Lingayats. So this is Kannada poetry, 12th century Kannada poetry, and 2,000 of those poems were translated into Maithili, and 200 of them I actually translated. I had a degree of choice, so there is a woman poet called Akka Mahadevi, so mostly I translated Akka Mahadevi. But I mentioned that in because I found that translation amongst Indian languages is easy. Going through English is more difficult. But as of today, the tradition of translation from, actually directly from source language into all Indian languages, that is going. So that way also English is becoming very important. So I do have translations, and that is where I think efforts like what Dr. Professor Yug is doing, I think his full name is Yugeshwar Sah, if I'm not mistaken. So whatever he's doing, we should welcome that, and hopefully even in the audience, if there are people listening, just as people who are Maithili speaking, that is, they should try to translate Maithili texts, just as a way of kind of acknowledging their debts to their mother tongue. But now let me come back to the topic of what I'm going to talk about. In fact, I have very pronounced views about Indian knowledge system, because this seminar was around contributions of Mithila to Indian knowledge system. So let me just make two or three kind of formulations. First formulation which I'm trying to make is that I think, and I will not get into the details of why it is, but there is a gentleman called Michel Foucault, French philosopher. He basically talks about genealogy of knowledge. Every knowledge, actually, or body of knowledge, is supported by the existing kind of socio-economic regime, political regime, and in turn, that helps that socio-economic and political regime to survive. So similarly, it's not a great kind of deal of imagination it takes as of today to realize that this renewed focus on Indian knowledge system has kind of a socio-political context. Now, in that context, I'm all for actually Indian knowledge systems, but I do believe that any Indian knowledge system, along with history, it also has to be about geography. So I'm saying that, let's not cherry pick, from historical points that let's go back to Mauryans, or let's go back to Gupta period, or let's go back to Vedic period. Whatever is happening in India as of today is a valid part of the body of Indian knowledge systems. This is my belief. In fact, as a Sutra Vakya, and I can see Professor Mishra in front of me, and Sanskrit Sahitya has a, whole tradition of Sutra Vakya. So as a Sutra Vakya, I am saying that Indian knowledge systems have to be also about geography, not only about history. If we don't do this, we are doing a disservice actually. So for example, there are so many AIMS which have opened in the country. And one way to look at it is that these AIMS gradually would make our health system better. But recently I heard from somebody that they were saying that AIMS Devghar, somebody was hospitalized and he did not get proper kind of attention. And they did not look at AIMS Devghar in the same manner as they looked at, say, AIMS Delhi. So now somebody has to look at it, that all the AIMS which have come actually they offer similar kind of services, and how can we actually make all AIMS as good as the AIMS in Delhi in terms of people's trust, in terms of systems, in terms of processes. So that is where, if we don't pay attention to geography, we are actually, and only get stuck with history, we are not doing a service to our population and our types. So that was as a Sutra Vakya I said. Now let me come back to the talk where I was actually going to talk about. So this is where I'm positing my own experiences, a lifetime of experience, because I started writing poetry when I was in school, maybe 12, 13. I told you I'm 61 this year, so basically around 48 years or 50 years of poetic work. I must kind of situate that as an example of knowledge creation and knowledge propagation in Mithila. So that is where it's a part of the Indian knowledge system, the contribution of Mithila. Methodology-wise, because I'm also trained in management, I'm a management researcher. So methodology-wise, something called autoethnography has become more popular in current times, that people reflect on their own experiences, because earlier the idea of researcher being a neutral observer in any situation was there, but now increasingly people realize that researchers are kind of people made of flesh and bone. They have their own biases, they have their own standpoints. So that is where this idea of autoethnography has also come in, that how can one not look at the biggest instrument? One has to look at one's own times, which is one's own lived experience. So that is where the idea of autoethnography has come in. So I assume that some of you may actually not have any formal introduction to Maithili literature. So I'll just give you some sense of Maithili literature when I come in. So my first published poem is in 1986 or thereabouts, though I was writing even before that. The first Kavi Sammelan which I attended actually was around 1984 or something. So basically, let me just tell you what was happening to Maithili literature at that point in time. The Maithili literature, in fact, somebody mentioned Jyotirishwar, and I have, 10 poems on Jyotirishwar. So I was invited to a seminar to talk about Jyotirishwar and Varna Ratnakar, and I actually ended up as a poet. I said I'll write 10 poems. So those poems, anyway, let me not do self kind of, prachar, so to say, because Pankaj said we should not do, PR for ourselves. So I'll not get into PR. But that is my stance about that. But that is interesting. I'm mentioning that as a reason that most of the literatures start with poetry. Now, in Mithila, basically, we make claims to Buddhist kind of poetry of Charyapad, poets like Sarahpad, Musutpad, and so on. Now, Charyapad, I again got very interested in my life, and I've been reading about Charyapad. So, Charyapad as a literature, actually, not only Maithil's claim, these are Buddhist hymns, a set of Buddhist hymns, 64 of them, Tantric Buddhist hymns. Let me be more clear about that. So, basically, not only Maithili speaking people lay claim to that, even Bangla speakers lay claim to that, even Odia speakers, Assamia speakers. So, basically, in terms of linguistic development, and let me just get into a moment in terms of the linguistic development. So, you have Sanskrit, you have Pali and Prakrit, and then you have Magadhi and Ardha Magadhi. So, actually, Maithili is derived from Ardha Magadhi, and even Bangla, Assamia, Odia, they trace their roots to Ardha Magadhi. So we could have had Charyapad people actually as our ancestors, but again, that was poetry. We come back to Varna Ratnakar or Varna Ratnakar. There are debates about that, amongst people, that whether Varna Ratnakar is a book of prose or it's a book of poetry. Whatever it is, I don't want to get into details. That is not my main issue right now. But Maithils do use that to say that here is a language in which prose was written much before in other languages. And that is why we are kind of some way superior. I don't actually buy that argument, but the idea is that Varna Ratnakar, and from Varna Ratnakar you come to the time of songs, which is Vidyapati and the Vidyapati's tradition, which is again these songs, if you realize earlier in modern times, they were claimed by Bangla literature, and then Suniti Kumar Chatterjee. He actually made decisive kind of intervention to show that this belonged to Maithili. And then, you have the Vidyapati Padavalis being found in Kathmandu's, libraries and so on, which established that actually Vidyapati was a Maithili poet. Again, I'm not getting into details, because as of today, and I'm inspired by Pankaj Mishraji because he has film references and songs and so on, which I found was very nice. So I must say this. So there was a fellow poet called Kulanand Mishra, and his father was a Sanskrit poet who was one of the most Sanskrit Vidwan, who was one of the most modern Sanskrit Vidwans I have ever met. So I have met some modern Sanskrit Vidwans in my life, like Radha Vallabh Tripathi, like, Kula Babu's father, and Pankaj Mishra goes in the same list. So basically, to come back what I was telling you, that, there are, in our own times, you will see that people attribute to Ghalib many Urdu poems, which you realize it's not written by Ghalib. So even about Vidyapati, because there is a technical term called Bhanita. Bhanita is who has written this poem. So there are a lot of people. There is also a conjecture who may have adopted Vidyapati's Bhanita because they realize that Vidyapati's think people will listen and they will not listen to me if I say that this is written by Vidyanand, so I should say it's written by Vidyapati. So there is also a conjecture I would say a conjecture right now, not a proof, that there is a great deal of kind of that there were a number of Vidyapatis. There was not a single Vidyapati. So we know for a fact that Vidyapati Thakur was a historical person. We also know for a fact that there are a large number of songs attributed to him, and not only songs. In fact, as a Sanskrit scholar, he wrote, in fact, he was a polymath. He wrote at least in 4 languages I am familiar with, okay. So he wrote in Abhate, he wrote in, actually, Ardhamarthi. So he wrote in multiple languages. And of course, his importance is also because there is a line, attributed to him, that Balachanda Vijjabai Bhasa, Duhunai Ladai Vijjana Bhasa. So apart from being a Sanskrit poet in his time, like in my time actually, I'm speaking to you in English. This is the language through which I earn my living. So similarly, his language of earning the living may have been something different, but he wrote poetry in his mother tongue too. So this was the older kind of period. The modern Maithili literature actually, so many of the Indian literatures, they start with translations of Ramayana or Mahabharata. So basically, even in Maithili, we have 2 translations of Ramayana, and one of them, interestingly, is called Janaki Ramayana. So basically, it also tells you that Mithila being the land of Janaki, and I don't know how you look at the relationship between Janaki and the whole Janaki story. So basically, this was a Ramayana trying to be written by Lal Das, written from the viewpoint of Janaki, and of course, then Chandajha wrote his own kind of Ramayana. We come to the modern period. Kavar Sitaram Jha was the person who's supposed to have started, and Pankajji, you mentioned about Jyotish. So Sitaram Jha in his other life was a Jyotishi actually. He was a Vidwan of Jyotish. And he was also a poet basically. Then one of the major figures is again a polymath. I like to take his Maithili name, Vidyanand Mishra Yatri. Vidyanand Mishra Yatri also wrote in a language called Hindi, and his pen name there was Nagarjun. And of course, much of the name, fame, money which he got in life was through Hindi. But remember that he actually was a Maithili poet. Before he started writing in Hindi, he was writing in Maithili. And his poetry actually was a people-oriented poetry. So basically, Yatri talks about the common people and their woes. There is a very interesting poem of Yatri written at 1947, how Indian independence should be viewed in Mithila. I think you should read that also to understand what is Mithila and what is happening to it. Then we have again major kind of figure, Rajkamal Chaudhary. Rajkamal Chaudhary again got his name fame from Hindi, but he wrote equally in Maithili and of course Maithili poetry and also Maithili stories. Let me just plug in, despite whatever Pankaj Mishra ji said, I should not plug in the PR. So it's all in good kind of purpose. Somebody did a book of Bihari literature, diplomat basically, called Abhay K, and it's published by I think HarperCollins. There are 8 stories, Maithili stories, which are translated by me and which appeared there. One of them is Rajkamal Chaudhary's story actually, and I'm very fond of that story. That story is called March, fish. Fish being the Shubhankar for Maithil Singh. So I think it's an interesting story. So that is the situation. When Maithili poetry was in terms of the delivery of poetry, poetry in Mithila till even 1940s is dominated by spoken poetry, Manchiya Kavita. And then you start having written poetry books which can be read and understood rather than listened and understood. They start kind of becoming important. And again, in my analysis, it has gone back to Manchiya Kavita. Basically, and that is not only happening to Maithili, world over orality actually is becoming important. So there is a very famous English poet based in Canada, a Sikh poet called Rupi Kaur, and her poetry is mostly oral. So this is the time in which I come into Maithili poetry, and then normally people think I'm in the 80 ka dashak, 90 ka dashak. This is the time when they find me. My reasons for writing poetry actually, and in my first book of poems, which was published by Sahitya Academy, the Sahitya Academy has this series called Navodaya series in different languages. So if there is any poet who's more than kind of less than 40 years and no book has been published, they actually, not only poetry, even other genres basically, they publish their books. So I became the first Navodaya series person in Maithili to be published by Sahitya Academy. So my book was called Parati Jaka, and in the other books actually I have refrained from giving any preface because I think poetry should speak for itself. But in that book, I thought that I should write something actually. So 2-3 things I have mentioned. I have mentioned where my poetry came from. My father was a poet, and he used to write poetry in Hindi through a name called Upnam called Masti. So his name was Haranand Jha, and he had this Upnam Mast. He never published his poetry, so we just saw after his death, we were looking at his old papers and we realized that there were 20-25 poems of his which were found in one place. So basically, I think poetry was in some ways in my blood. I must acknowledge my debts to my mother. So my mother was a very curious person, and I have formally declared that my kind of sense of words comes from my mother. So for poets, words are the main kind of thing. That was my first book, which I published when it got published in 2002. So I was already quite old, at that point in time, 37-year-old. Now, if I compare myself with, say, a Bangla poet, they would have their first book of poems when they started writing it in their school, and so on. One of the reasons, and you need to understand this, why in Maithili we do not have people publishing when they are young or poets publishing very many kind of books, that I have written a poem about. And that poem became problematic because I used a metaphor which was very different kind of metaphor. So that poem, I said that my poetry books sit in, almiras without distribution because unemployed daughters and unmarried sons. So this is the metaphor on which people actually took a fight with me, that I have to write unmarried daughters and unemployed sons. So I just tried to kind of the way I look at it, that is how I put it. But the main issue they missed. Main issue is that in Maithili there is no distribution. Most of the publishing is self-publishing. I pay the publisher and they send these copies to me. Now, I'm not a distributor. I'm a poet. I can write poetry. So how will I distribute? So just to, bring a word from Maithili, there is a word called Bain Tihar. Bain is, reciprocal kind of gifting. So on special occasions like festivals and so on, you send gifts to somebody and they send gift again to you. So in Maithili, the distribution of literary books is through Bain Tihar. So there are some people who send me their book, I send them my book, and that is how it happens. So my daughter, when she was younger, somebody asked her that when you grow up, what do you want to become? She said, I'll just sell my father's poetry and make a living out of it. That is very difficult in most of the languages. In Maithili, that's impossible. And then once when she grew up, when she was much older, she told me that, what kind of people are you? The people who could buy your books, you just send them as gifts, and others anyway don't know about it, so they will not buy it. So anyway, the idea is that there is a less distribution. And that is not only with me, that is actually with all my three poets, that is what is happening. I have three books to my credit. So one book was, I told you, when I was 37. Second book was well after I was in my 50s. And the third book basically was, pretty soon after, took just 2-3 years after that. Fourth book, I have 100 poems almost. Now I'm getting kind of worried about that it would become an unwieldy book. So the poem should have maybe 50, 60 at the max, kind of poetry book should have that much. But the question which I actually often ask myself, that who will read it? Why should I do it? And that is the question to most of the Maithili literature persons in our time. Now, let me get into what is the reason for that. Some of the reasons is very plain in sight. So I started reading Maithili. My education did not happen through Maithili. My education happened initially through Hindi, which was a second language to me. Because, hamra daan mein dard hoyi hai, that is the bodily functions. If I have to, even today, I have to go to a doctor and say, sabsabai hai, deh sabsabai hai. What do I say in Hindi? What do I say in English? So basically, this is a larger level alienation which has happened to this geography because people are not taught in their mother tongue. Right now, India is in throes of something called new education policy. And actually, I don't have much hope from new education policy. Because new education policy says that mother tongue should be privileged in terms of education. But society itself right now has gone away from mother tongue. Because all the rewards in society, jobs, etc., English is the way to go. You actually judge your prime ministers by the fact that whether they can speak good English or they can't speak good English. This should not have been an issue. I can speak as a prime minister. If I'm a Maithili speaker, I should speak in Maithili and there should be translations. But then this is how people actually give importance to English and, in case of Mithila, to Hindi. And that is how, for whatever reason, despite. So Maithili education in Mithila should be through mother tongue. Not only NEP, actually Bihar government has many kind of policies to do that. I was talking somewhere on this year in Calcutta on International Mother Tongues Day, 21st February. I went to a local college and I looked up actually that Bihar government as long back as 1940s has these kind of, statements, these kind of policies that basically Maithili should be taught in the region called Mithila. What is the region called Mithila? That itself now is a matter of getting debate. And the debate, to my mind, is because Mithila is not a political entity. It's basically, just we don't know. It's a cultural entity. It's not a political entity. So Maithili is not a language of statecraft. It's not a language of commerce. Only place where we actually privilege Maithili is our personal private spaces. So I have a poem there. In fact, learning from Fanikant Mishraji that I can talk for 8 hours. So I could have also talked for 8 hours just by talking about my poetry. So in one of my poems, I talk about Maithil existence in India. That we are like Bhagjogni. Bhagjogni or fireflies, they only glow in dark. So Maithils, they glow in Maithili only in their home. All other places, they just speak somebody else's language, so to say. So to come back to, what I was telling you about my lived experience as Maithili poet. One of the things which has happened to Maithili poetry and to me also, that Maithili, when I was growing up, had a very well-established journal called Mithila Mihir. So Mithila Mihir came from the, stable of the newspapers which were established by Raj Darbhanga which was Aryabhat, Indian Nation, and Mithila Mihir also they used to publish. Mithila Mihir, Aryabhat stopped publishing, Indian Nation stopped publishing, and Mithila Mihir also stopped publishing. The history of literary journals, or what in Bengal people call little magazines, is quite long in Mithila. There were actually basically one of the first Maithili magazines started coming out from Banarasi. There were these Maithili speaking people who went there to study Sanskrit at Banaras, and then they started publishing these journals. But as of today, there are no long lasting kind of Maithili journals. Social media actually helped there. So in fact, most of the poets of my time in Maithili, they published their poems on Facebook. Facebook, my daughter told me that it's only for uncles and aunties, because now young people are not on Facebook, they have moved away to Instagram. But basically, Facebook is the way for me to connect with Maithili readership. I have this doubt that maybe they just see the post and tick, say like, because I don't know whether they're really reading it. But reach-wise, if I publish a poem on Facebook, at least 50 people, it seems to like it. And given the kind of situation in Maithili poetry in which there is not too many journals, and even if I publish in the existing journals, it will take so much time to go there. It will be really tough, so to say. Let me, I seem to be running out of time. Actually, it's 12 o'clock. So let me just very briefly tell you how I experience our times as a Maithili poet. So basically, once I compared Maithili poets to Hebrew poets. Hebrew poets, if you realize, they are spread throughout the world. So Maithili poets are spread throughout the world. So I know of poets from Qatar, I know of poets from UK, I know of poets from US. They don't have any motherland. So that is where we also don't have a motherland. So there is no geographical place where this kind of poetry kind of gets privileged. Second thing is that basically it's a poetry of exile there. Basically, wherever you are living, there is a notion of public and there is notion of private. In public sphere, we don't have any kind of actually identity. It's only in private spaces that we end up kind of talking about. So that is where, in fact, I have as my role as Maithili critique, I have always pointed out that much of Maithili literature keeps on going back to villages. So I have written about it almost 20 years back, that cities in Mithila region are India, are actually Bihar, but villages are still Mithila. So Mithila, and that is where emotionally Maithili literature goes back to the village. Now that village also is not a good village, because it's not a village of today, it's a remembered village. Because suppose I'm living in Calcutta and writing about a village, I'll write about village of past actually. So essentially, to come back as a poet, what my experiencing of my times is. I think we are by nature kind of exiles. Our identity, in recent times, we are trying to find some kind of refuge in larger identities, which I have my own views about. So I believe that going back to Sanskrit or Sanskrit-based identities is not the solution, because you have the history of whole of medieval kind of Vidyapati himself happening, Kabir happening, Raidas happening. So you just can't now go back in history and say, let's go back to a Vedic past. You also have to account for what happened in between. In fact, whole of Bhasha literature is an account of people's literature in their own times, basically. So my concerns remain about how people actually experience the world at this point in time. as a poet. That is what I try to bring in my poetry. I realize we are at 12:03. I don't want to take time from the next session. Thank you, Vijay ji, for allowing me to talk. I wish it was a more coherent talk. Actually, I seem to have gone here and there. Hopefully, at some other point, it has given me rehearsal for a next kind of talk. If there are any quick questions, I would have been happy, but I don't see people asking questions, and I often teach online quite a lot. So I have my own worries about यहाँ सब अखन से मने तरकारी बना रहल छी बैस के सबके हमर गप अहाँ सब सुन रहल छी, ठीक छै से चिंता हमरा